Okay. Good afternoon. We're grateful you are able to join us today for this program on aging and human rights. This event is sponsored by the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights and the County Office for the Aging. I am Ken Clark, Director of the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights. I want to thank my county colleagues, Lisa Monroe, Director of COFA, as we call the Office for the Aging, and Karen Bullis, COFA's Deputy Director, for helping plan this event, which features one of the most forward-thinking scholars and advocates in the field of gerontology, Professor Elizabeth Bergman. I just want to say before I go further in my welcome and introduction that if you may be getting emails from colleagues about trying to access the proper link to this program, that would ask them to check their emails, their most recent emails, where there is the proper link attached for today's program. We apologize for this inconvenience. The United Nations, under the rubric of human rights, created a document called United Nations Principles for Older Persons in 1991. Just as the UN developed overarching and universal principles for human rights in 1948, it affirms specifically the important role of the aging in human society. It affirms the dignity and worth, the contributions, wisdom, and diversity of senior citizens. These principles acknowledge that individuals are reaching an advanced age at greater numbers and in better health than ever before, while also recognizing the challenges of care and support for older persons in declining health. Emerging from this document are 5 principles governmental bodies are encouraged to acknowledge, support, and ensure in their interactions with older persons: independence, participation, care, self-fulfillment, and dignity. Human Rights Watch recognizes that many elders are victims of human rights violations worldwide, including our own country, which is the antithesis of these 5 principles. Many of these violations are undocumented. We also know there are disparities in the health of the aging driven by social determinants, which creates social stratification. There's a movement afoot to strengthen the global enforcement of the protection of seniors. The National Council on Aging reports that 6 major U.S. organizations on aging sent a letter to U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, urging her to draft the UN Convention on the Rights of Older Persons. This convention, first considered by the UN 13 years ago, would be a legally binding treaty that would promote and protect the human rights of older persons worldwide. These factors are part of the larger context that inform the work and scholarship of our speakers today. As Director of Ithaca College's Gerontology Institute, Elizabeth Bergman seeks to position her organization, according to Ithaca.com, as a campus and community resource to promote and support research, community education, and community service activities for the aging. And one of their specialties is end-of-life care. She and our colleagues recognize, as the legendary theologian and spiritual genius Howard Thurman wrote, death is a part of life. She is committed to affirming the human rights of elders during their lives and ensuring that the living of their final days affirm their dignity and work. Professor Bergman, welcome, and we are looking forward to your presentation this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ken, and also to Dominic, who behind the scenes is making things happen. Would you give me a thumbs up if volume is all right on my end and we seem to be okay? All right, great. Thank you. I am grateful to be here and grateful to your office, Dr. Clark, for accommodating the fact that I am not in Ithaca physically right now. Glad to be able to participate virtually nonetheless. I would like to ask at the outset of this talk if it would be possible for those in attendance to please share your name, email address, and organization that you represent, if that's applicable to your situation. If not, it's fine. With us, Dominic in the background is going to create the opportunity for that to happen. Thank you. This is useful to us from the perspective of our grant funding through the Finger Lakes Geriatric Education Center. We are very grateful to your being willing to share that information with you. And I promise we will not spam you with lots of emails by virtue of sharing your email address with us. So I am going to launch in and deliver my talk. There will be time for questions and discussion at the end. And I look forward to engaging around these topics. My work in the last several years has focused primarily on ageism and the way in which ageism is experienced by people of all ages, and the way in which it impacts people's opportunities and self-perceptions and behaviors and many other aspects of their lives in ways that I think many of us aren't particularly attuned to. Ageism is not a form of oppression that is widely discussed. In fact, the World Health Organization describes ageism as the last socially acceptable form of prejudice in our society. I want to start by setting the stage. What do I mean when I use the word aging? When we think of aging, we tend to think of it as a biological process. We tend to equate it to the process of senescence. When we talk about aging as a biological process, we're actually talking about senescence, the biological process that leads to the gradual deterioration of function in our cells and or organisms. This is applying a declinist perspective and equating or essentially framing aging as a medical problem. And yes, as Ken mentioned at the outset, senescence and the processes of physical decline are embedded within the totality of the aging process. We are mortal beings and will all eventually decline and die. But aging and dying are distinctly different processes. Tracy Gendron, PhD, a scholar of gerontology at Virginia Commonwealth University and author of a recently released book that I will point you to later in my talk, says, dying is gradually ceasing to exist or function. Aging is living, evolving, and growing. So classifying aging firmly within the biomedical model as decline, degeneration, and death ignores the holistic and multi-directional paradox of aging and encourages pathologizing aging as a medical problem. Aging is, in fact, a slow and steady process of change, some good, some bad, much neutral, that ultimately leads us to becoming our unique individual selves. I heard colleague Nancy Morrow Howell at Wash University recently say, we're born as molds and die as originals. Aging is the universal, lifelong, biological, yes, but also psychological, social, and spiritual process of developing and growing over time. Aging is dynamic. It includes all processes, including growth and loss and maintenance and adaptation. Aging is multidimensional and multidirectional. It's universal, yet distinctive and unique to the individual. Thus, there is a saying among geriatricians and others who work in the healthcare field with older adults specifically, if you've seen one 80-year-old, you've seen one 80-year-old. Based in part on falsely equating aging and senescence, we humans have a very complicated relationship with aging. It has always been that way. However, it has evolved over time. I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes providing a very oversimplified historical overview in the broadest of strokes, and share with you a little about the history of elders and the history of reverence for older people. Ancient cultures valued older people for their experience, their knowledge, and their survival skills. In Christian traditions, we see much evidence of reverence for older adults, as exemplified by some of the quotes that are on the screen. And elders became the official religious leadership in the early Christian church and were appointed as overseers for local congregations. Also, in the Islamic tradition, we see reverence for old age as a tenet of Islam, as reflected in the views of the Prophet Muhammad. Older people assumed roles as teachers, healers, and historians. Older people served as the keepers of vital knowledge, essential to survival. In ancient cultures, it makes sense that older people would be the people who know the location of the good water holes and the plants that are edible versus the plants that are poisonous, and other important pieces of knowledge that ensured the survival of their group. And their power was predicated on their accumulation of life experiences. I don't know what's going on here. Sorry. Okay. The rise of science and technology contributed to a decreasing value placed on older people. This is not limited to, but one very prominent example was in the year 1440, the development of a mechanical device that applied pressure to an inked surface, thereby transferring text with ease. This was an invention created by German Johannes Gutenberg, as I said, in 1440, the printing press, which made possible the rapid creation, distribution, and preservation of written material. As such, elders were no longer as needed in their roles as the primary historians, storytellers, and living encyclopedias, if you will, and their status and power in the community diminished over time as a direct result. This is but one example, but one very, very prominent example. I mentioned that the historical perspective was going to be oversimplified and in broad strokes. So let's fast forward about 500 years to the 1960s, when a neuropsychiatrist, Dr. Robert Butler, looked around at society and noticed some really important distinctions in terms of the way people were thought of based on their age. And as such, he coined the term ageism in 1968, which is a term referring to stereotyping and discrimination against people based on age. He coined this term during an interview with the then fledgling Washington Post reporter, Carl Bernstein. He says that he learned the simple truth about aging from his maternal grandparents, who raised him on a chicken farm in South New Jersey, that life is what you make of it at whatever age. He went on to become the founding director of the National Institute on Aging, the founding chair of the Department of Geriatrics and Adult Development at Mount Sinai Medical Center, the first academic department of its kind in the United States, and to win a Pulitzer Prize in 1975 for his book, Why Survive? Being Old in America. The early days of work around ageism were quiet and not widely known. There has been a lot of activity and research and advocacy and scholarship that has been happening more recently, and I'm going to point to many very recent examples later in my talk. Stereotypes are the often unconscious devices that we use to rapidly assess our fellow human beings. A lot of the time, however, these pictures aren't based on observed or lived experience, but rather absorbed uncritically from our external social world. We don't often realize these unconscious beliefs even exist within us, and they often go against what we consciously believe. This is called implicit bias, as I imagine you know. Whether conscious or unconscious, how we think, feel, and act toward oneself or others based on age is known as ageism. Dr. Gendron, the gerontology researcher and author I mentioned earlier, describes ageism as the shame-inducing, anxiety-producing, guilt-mongering force in our culture that is both everywhere and all but invisible. Advertisements and media tell us what to look like, how to feel, and what to value. Even those who are attuned to this might feel like they can avoid falling prey, but practically and psychologically, we are all susceptible to all pervasive meta-narratives. You might know that the latest look younger product is nothing more than snake oil. Pro tip, they are actually nothing more than snake oil, but your brain still does the equations. Younger equals good, older equals bad. The meaning that we assign to being old and the concept of age identity is socially constructed. We create social constructs to help us make sense of the world, and they have a powerful influence on how we view people and how we interpret their behavior. We have an accepted understanding that old and young are two distinct and separate states of being. According to our social construct, young people are prone to act irresponsibly, maybe even dangerously, but they're also attractive and vibrant and looking forward to promising futures. Old people, on the other hand, are seen as a homogeneous group comprising people who are frail, dependent, problematic, and fast on their way to becoming incompetent and irrelevant. These social constructions serve as a roadmap for the age-related behaviors to which we expect people to conform. So we expect young people to take calculated risks, and we expect old people to be content, quietly sitting in a rocking chair and watching the world go by. That may be true for some young people and some old people, but it's not true for all people based on age. There's nothing about the actual definition of young or old that points to value judgments or behavioral expectations. Old has to do with having lived or existed for a long time, young for a short time. Young and old are not either good or bad states of being, they just are. The bottom line here is that we don't have a ready alternative to the narrative of older adulthood as a period of decline. And that reinforces our fears of aging and our ageist thoughts and behaviors. Also, ageism has negative consequences to our health and happiness throughout our lives, and that affects us at all stages. And ageism represents a social justice and human rights issue. There are three primary types of ageism. We'll start with interpersonal ageism, and this includes the things that we say to one another and in our one-on-one or small group interactions. So consider the following example. When John runs into Mary, he says, "Mary, so good to see you. You haven't aged a day since I saw you 10 years ago." Mary replies, "Thank you, John. What a nice thing to say. You just made my day." Self-directed ageism includes the way we think about our own aging and the things we believe about our own abilities, behavior, and value based on our age. Ashton Applewhite, author and scholar and prominent anti-ageist, offers the following example. When we attribute the pain in our left knee to being old, without stopping to think about the fact that our right knee doesn't hurt at all and it's just as old, we self-limit our opportunities and cheat ourselves out of the potential for healing. And third, institutional, or sometimes called structural ageism, refers to policies or practices of social institutions, such as corporations, that discriminate against older workers, or hospitals that discriminate against older patients. Structural ageism is intertwined with implicit bias, for within institutions, discrimination may operate without a provider's awareness and therefore can be considered implicit. But at the same time, it's often structural insofar as the discrimination reinforces the power of those in authority while withholding power from those who are marginalized. If we unconsciously believe that old age is a time of inevitable decline, depression, and loss, in our professional capacities, we may not work to assure access to medical interventions, to all aspects of our societies that has the potential to dramatically improve the quality of life for older people, or to encourage our older clients or patients to continue exercising or maintaining meaningful activities. Structural ageism is reflected in the legal system, in healthcare provisions, in economic practices, in the built environment, and in many other aspects of our society. We'll touch on a number of examples of these later in my talk, but age limits, healthcare access prioritization based on age, as we saw during the COVID pandemic, and the lack of widely available environmental supports, things like ramps, ADA, accessible facilities, and appropriate lighting, are all types of structural ageism. And ageism frequently intersects with ableism. If you've ever dined in a restaurant with hard to read menus in minuscule font sizes, a poorly lit environment with distracting music or lots of ambient noise in the background, you've experienced structural ageism and ableism as they intersect. As regardless of age, those with any sensory challenge would find themselves at a disadvantage in this type of environment as well. Ageism intersects with other systems of oppression besides those based on ability, and these intersections shape the accumulation of advantages and disadvantages over time. The way we experience aging, and therefore ageism, is contingent upon our other forms of identity. Kimberly Crenshaw termed the coin intersectionality to capture overlapping and independent systems of discrimination and privilege that intersect to influence life experiences and create multiple layers of marginalization. The impact of ageism cannot be completely disentangled from experience with other forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, classism, sexual orientation, and gender identity. The opportunity for healthy aging and longevity are shaped in large part by our families, our neighborhoods, and all of the external systems that we count on to get the things we need. Without access to safe housing, adequate healthcare, and healthy food, disadvantages accumulate over the years and disproportionately affect people already at risk, such as people of color, women, and members of the LGBTQ+ population, to name a few. As a result of a lifetime of deprivation due to poverty, systemic racism and sexism, lack of equal opportunity, and historical and generational trauma, inequities accrue and have adverse long-term effects. This intersectionality is exacerbated further as disenfranchisement based on racial and gender identity combine with age oppression as we grow older. As much as ageism intersects with other forms of oppression to acculturate advantage or disadvantage, ageism is also unique in that it is something everyone will encounter and is essentially the manifestation of our prejudice towards our future selves. I'm going to run through several examples of the effects that ageism has. I'm going to skip a couple of these, though, in the interest of time. And as a result, most of the examples that I cover are going to be focused on health and healthcare, but I want to be really clear that we are that ageism affects people across social institutions and aspects of life, not just in the area of health and healthcare. Older adults represent the foremost consumers of healthcare services worldwide, yet negative attitudes and the behaviors toward older people persist across healthcare settings and among medical professionals. One of many studies demonstrated that patterns of treatment recommendations vary solely based on age. Physicians and med school students were provided with 2 hypothetical cases of women with breast cancer that were identical except for the person's age. When asked to provide treatment recommendations, students were more likely to recommend the fictitious younger patients for the more aggressive therapy, whereas they recommended the modified and more conservative treatment for the older patients. Age alone dictating medical decision-making is problematic and unethical, given that we know age alone is a very poor indicator of health status or one's ability to recover. Possible explanation revolves around an idea called terror management theory, which postulates that humans have an innate ego protective mechanism to separate themselves from the negative aspects of old age. Ageism results from older people being a constant reminder to others of their mortality and vulnerability. This is particularly salient for medical professionals, who are primarily exposed to the most vulnerable and frail older adults in their context of providing healthcare, and can lead directly to othering those in our care who provoke deep-seated fears in us. Ageism in healthcare is also impacted by a number of other factors, including the desire to focus on curative medicine, the sometimes complexities of evaluating, diagnosing, and managing multiple comorbidities, and the systemic focus on efficiency and productivity concerning reimbursement rates and payments in the healthcare arena. Also, we've seen a tremendous progress in terms of the training of healthcare professionals since the 1980s, including specific geriatrics training inserted into medical education. However, despite the tremendous need for geriatricians and those with geriatric training, interest in geriatrics as a specialization is excessively underwhelming. There's also a hidden curriculum in medical school that represents the socialization process whereby medical students learn through communication and patient interactions modeled by their preceptors, by their teachers and mentors. In the training process, explicit bias toward older people is modeled. Reliance on stereotypes for therapeutic decision-making is also modeled, and interpersonal interactions infantilizing or demeaning older people is something that medical students are exposed to. Ageist biases may lead medical professionals and older patients to believe that pain and suffering are expected aspects of old age. This nihilistic attitude diminishes opportunities for older people to seek treatments and to improve their quality of life. Also at play are the interpersonal dynamics of the physician-patient relationship. Older people are commonly left out of the decision-making process. Indeed, how many of us have accompanied an older person to the doctor only to have the doctor talk to us rather than to their patient who is also sitting in the room? Or perhaps we have been that older patient ourselves who is ourself invisible in the examination room. Also, prominent is the use of elder speak, which refers to the characteristic slower, louder, simplified, and patronizing speech that is used with communicating with an older person. This is something that I'm talking about today in reference to healthcare, but something that happens regardless of setting. And I encourage everyone to pay attention Observe yourself next time you're communicating with someone of different ages and notice what changes about the way you interact with people, older, younger, and of similar age as yourself. Elder speak is disempowering, and it reinforces other-directed and self-directed ageism. Indeed, someone loudly shouting honey or sweetie at us does little for our self-esteem or for our confidence. Finally, within the healthcare system, Medicare has different lower reimbursement rates for medications and services from those private insurance provides to younger people. Medicare reimbursement policies do not cover many preventive services or part-time support services to help older people in need of minimal assistance to stay safe in their own homes. And doctors can and often do opt out of accepting Medicare patients and therefore opt out of treating many older people. So now I want to look a little bit at some recent work by Dr. Becca Levy and colleagues, and I'll reference some reading material from Dr. Levy that I highly recommend later in the talk. Levy and colleagues looked at costs related to 3 domains of ageism: age discrimination, negative age stereotypes, and negative self-perceptions of aging. Age discrimination is measured using measures that assess how often the participants in this study experienced a set of occurrences based on their age, including, for example, you are treated with less courtesy or respect than other people. Negative age stereotypes are measures which ask participants to rate items on whether they are true, such as forgetfulness is a natural occurrence just from growing old. And negative self-perceptions of aging are measures which ask participants how much they agreed with 5 items, including, for example, the older I get, the more useless I feel. Levy and colleagues dichotomized the population in the study into 2 groups, high and low in these 3 areas, these 3 domains, and then calculated the excess healthcare spending due to ageism for 8 of the 10 most expensive health conditions in the United States, controlling statistically for a range of other factors known to contribute. The excess annual cost was $11.1 billion. The excess annual cost was $11.1 billion for age discrimination. It was $28.5 billion annually for negative age stereotypes, and it was $33.7 billion for negative self-perceptions of aging. The total cost of the ageism predictors after removing overlap between them for the 8 most expensive health conditions in the United States was $63 billion in a year. This equates to 15.5% of overall healthcare spending for these conditions among those 60 years or older in 1 year. To calculate the number of health conditions themselves due to ageism, Levy and colleagues determined the number of people in the high ageism group, as well as the difference in health condition rates for those in the low and high ageism groups that was done for each of the 8 most expensive health conditions, adjusting again for factors like age and sex in their model. They concluded that 17 million cases of the health conditions are due to ageism. This means that even a 10% reduction in the prevalence of ageism in our society could lead to 1.7 million fewer cases of the 8 most expensive health conditions in the United States. In summary, for each of the predictors and health conditions, the cost per person was significantly higher among those in the high ageism group compared to those in the low ageism group. Further, the prevalence of each health condition was significantly greater for the high than the low ageism group. Positive age beliefs, again, this is work from Dr. Becca Levy. She found that positive age beliefs are associated with resisting dementia. This is true for everyone, even those of us with the ApoE4 allele, that's the Alzheimer's gene that you may have heard of, making us genetically predisposed to dementia if we have that particular allele. Levy and colleagues found that dementia incidence they assessed dementia incidence over 4 years, adjusting for covariates among participants who were dementia-free at the beginning of the study, and found a significant difference between those with positive and negative age beliefs among participants in the total sample, as well as in the group that was identified as having the ApoE4 Alzheimer's gene that puts them at significantly higher risk for Alzheimer's disease. Priming people with age stereotypes, just exposing them to age stereotypes, impacts how we see ourselves and respond in our environment. In one study, participants were presented with one of 3 fictional speeches held at a gerontology conference. There were 3 versions, depending on the image of the older adult portrayed by the speaker, either a positive portrayal, a negative portrayal, or a neutral portrayal of the older adults portrayed by the speaker. Participants were then asked to respond to a number of questions and complete a range of tasks. Researchers found that those who were exposed to a negative aging stereotype reported increased self-reported loneliness compared to a positive aging stereotype or a neutral control condition. Participants in the negative aging stereotype group were more risk averse. That it led to a description of themselves as being in a more deteriorated health condition and as less extroverted than their counterparts in the positive stereotype condition. Taken together, these findings show that exposing older individuals to ageist stereotypes can have various consequences on their functioning reminiscent of a helpless or dependent state. These implications of these findings are straightforward. The mere activation of a negative stereotype leads older people to feel more lonely, to depreciate their health status, to avoid taking risks, and to avoid systematically seeking for help in their social environment. These effects are similar to those symptoms that are frequently encountered in institutionalized settings where there is a context of enhanced dependence and loss of independence. Coming back to the work of Levy, and this one is particularly striking. People with positive perceptions of aging live longer. Controlling for other factors, people who view aging more positively live longer than people who view it more negatively. That is, people who make the effort to understand aging as a process of growth and change and not as equated to senescence or simply as a process of decline and deterioration. Those folks live longer, controlling for other factors. Levy and colleagues examined data from the Ohio longitudinal study of aging and retirement, which included participants from Oxford, Ohio, starting in 1975 and following them for many decades. They matched that data with data from the National Death Index to examine the impact of self-perceptions on aging on survival probability, controlling for age at baseline, gender, race, socioeconomic status, baseline functional health, self-rated health, and loneliness, all things also known to be associated with longevity. Those with more positive aging self-perceptions at baseline lived longer, After those relevant factors were controlled for, the median survival of those in the more positive self-perceptions of aging group was 7.6 years longer than the median survival of those in the more negative age self-stereotype group. In other words, controlling for other known influences, people with more positive aging self-perceptions live longer to the tune of 7.5 years. Ageism strips away economic, political, and social rights and opportunities for older people. It's a civil rights and human rights issue because it creates barriers for older people to access political, social, health, and other freedoms and equality in our society. An analysis of aspects and the population of 3 neighborhoods in Tel Aviv found that higher levels of ageism among residents in those neighborhoods led to social exclusion and isolation of older people living in those neighborhoods. Taking into account the circularity and reciprocal nature of social integration and ageism, it's necessary to develop services that increase intergroup contacts and provide more opportunities for social exchange, creating more opportunities for intergenerational programs that can provide frequent and meaningful contacts between young and old, improve older persons' quality of life, and decrease younger persons' negative stereotypes toward the aged. Also, the removal of barriers that hinder service accessibility and limit their activities can help to increase social integration of older people and make their communities more age-friendly. For more on the age-friendly movement, I refer you to the amazing work of the Tompkins County Office for the Aging and the Ithaca Tompkins County Age-Friendly Center for Excellence, led by Lisa Monroe, our COFA director. Skip the next slide. In a survey by Davis, actually, I'm going to skip this one too. So how do we combat ageism? What do we do about it? I'm going to share 3 strategies that, according to the World Health Organization's recent global report on ageism, have been proven effective in combating ageism. And I encourage everyone to think about ways that they can engage around these strategies, ways that we in Tompkins County and in other communities can engage in this kind of work and make opportunities available for people across the life course. The first domain of strategies that work in addressing ageism is policy and the law. The enactment of policies and laws constitutes an important strategy that can be used to reduce or eliminate ageism, especially discrimination on the grounds of age. Examples of policies include establishing mechanisms for complaints and plans for action in employment, health, and other institutions that seek to eliminate age-based discrimination and to empower people to claim their rights to equal access and participation. The way in which policies and laws reduce ageism is fourfold. First, outlawing a given behavior or practice can reduce that behavior to the extent that sanctions are consistently imposed. For example, employers are less likely to discriminate when anti-discrimination laws are in place, given that these create a cost to the employer. Second, policies and laws can help reduce ageism by creating a clear social norm that ageism is socially unacceptable. Being aware of the stance of one's community has been shown to impact the extent of prejudice one expresses, even when attitudes are stated privately and there is no possibility of criticism. Third, government-level policies and laws, by forcing people to change their behavior, can eventually change most people's underlying attitudes too, as they will need to reconcile the dissonance between their attitudes and their behavior. Fourth, laws and policies can increase diversity in the surrounding population, for example, in the workforce. and shape the physical and sensory surroundings, which in turn affect the degree of implicit bias that individuals exhibit. For example, laws regulating discrimination in the workplace can increase the presence of representatives of protected groups, in this case, older people, as well as prohibit the use of demeaning visual depictions of a particular group, which can lower implicit bias among members of that group. Next is the category of educational activities. Educational strategies to reduce ageism refer to a diversity of activities, which include instruction that transmits information, knowledge, skills, and competencies aimed at reducing ageist stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. They also include activities intended to enhance empathy through perspective taking, using, for instance, role-playing, simulation, or virtual reality. Most educational efforts to date have taken place in formal educational settings, like schools, colleges, universities. And even there, they are quite limited in terms of exposure to knowledge and education about age and aging. And in most cases, one has to seek out those educational opportunities as opposed to being exposed to them as a matter of course. And only a few have taken place in non-formal learning settings like a workplace or a community center. So kudos to you all for sponsoring this particular presentation. Educational interventions that seek primarily to transmit information and knowledge operate on the assumption that stereotypes, prejudices, and discrimination are the result of lack of or mistaken information and misconceptions. Providing accurate information and counter stereotypic examples, dispelling misconceptions about a particular age group, allow people to consciously reconsider and update their beliefs, feelings, and behaviors, and lead to a decrease in ageism. Indeed, I see this in the classroom every semester when students come in with exactly the kinds of stereotypes that you might expect. Older people drive slow, they smell funny, they are politically conservative, they are, the stereotypes. And they end the semester appreciating that none of those are indeed true about older people as a group. It's true of some older people, just as it's true of some younger people and some middle-aged people, etc. Empathy enhancing activities are a type of educational intervention that is increasingly used to address ageism. Empathy refers to the ability to sense other people's emotions and to imagine what someone else might be thinking or feeling. Empathy enhancing activities aim to generate identification with and awareness of another person's or group's suffering, generally through perspective taking exercises used to counter stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. These exercises increase emotional engagement, compassion, and a desire to help. And finally, and perhaps most impactful, at least in my experience, is intergenerational interventions, which aim to foster interaction between people of different generations. They are an important strategy to tackle ageism. If you think about our society, we are extremely age segregated, and breaking down those barriers and bringing people into contact with one another, people of different ages, particularly, I think, impactful is bringing together people who are not related. In my classrooms every semester, students come in and they articulate these stereotypes, right? Once we've established a culture of safety in the classroom. And then they say, but none of those things is actually true of my grandma, she's the best. And then I expose them over the course of the semester to a range of other older people that they're not related to, and they realize, oh, wait, it's not just my grandma, it's just that my grandma is one of the very few, if only older people that I get a chance to interact with on a regular basis. Intergenerational strategies aim to foster interaction between people of different generations. They typically involve bringing together older and younger people people to work collaboratively or cooperatively on tasks to encourage cross-generational bonding and understanding. Intergenerational strategies involve face-to-face interaction, which can occur in various contexts, such as older and younger people playing games or engaging in leisure pursuits like gardening or making art or engaging in music therapy together, teaching one another, younger people visiting retirement communities or doing service learning with older people, addressing an issue in their community to which they share a commitment. Older people conducting extended interviews or holding discussions with younger people or vice versa, etc. The opportunities are endless. Facilitating contact between groups under optimal conditions reduces intergroup prejudices and stereotypes to a lesser extent by reducing anxiety about intergroup contact and increasing perspective taking and empathy. Optimal conditions occur when both groups have equal status and common goals. I mentioned that I was going to share a couple of resources. If you're interested in learning more about the topic of ageism, these are two books that are very high on my recommended list of reading right now. They're both very current. The first, Breaking the Age Code, is authored by Becca Levy, whose work I cited earlier. Dr. Levy is someone whose scholarly work I've followed for a couple of decades, and she has very recently published this book that is written for the general public that explains her academic work in an incredibly powerful way and helps explain how it is that people with more positive self-perceptions of aging actually live 7.5 years longer. What are the pathways or the mechanisms through which that happens? Turns out there are 3 of them, and she goes deep into these explanations in this book, and I really highly recommend it. It's also a great opportunity for the reader to bring into consciousness their own implicit biases related to aging and ageist beliefs. We all have them. And examining their own beliefs and harnessing the power of having more positive age beliefs in our own lives. The other book, Ageism Unmasked by Dr. Tracy Gendron, who I cited earlier in the talk, is another terrific book that helps us understand ageism, micro, macro, and its impacts. And as it happens, the Ithaca College Gerontology Institute is sponsoring an intergenerational community read of this book in the fall. And we would love to invite anyone who is interested in participating to do that. This QR code that's on the screen right now, if you have a cell phone handy and want to snap a picture of this will take you to a form online where you can indicate your interest in participating. We do have, on a limited basis, some books that we can provide to individuals who would like to get a copy of the book. And this will be a virtual community read of this book, and an intergenerational group consisting of Ithaca College students and anyone from the community who wants to participate will come together on 4 occasions to discuss their read of this book. So if you want to grab this QR code, you can do that. I also, on the next slide, have provided my email address, and do please feel free to just email me and let me know that as well, and we will get you that information. So that wraps up my formal remarks, and I just want to say thank you for having me and for shining a bright light on this topic. And I'm happy to engage in some discussion around it.
Well, Elizabeth, one of the things that struck me in your presentation, first of all, thank you so much for such a thoroughgoing, comprehensive presentation. But when you talked about how the rise of science and technology led to a decline in reverence for elders, do you think that might have been another factor that is related to that, not only with the emergence of the printing press, but also this tendency, which you especially see, well, perhaps a couple of centuries later in the Enlightenment period, there's a tendency to classify and compartmentalize, as opposed to a more holistic way of looking at reality, integrative, organic type of reality.
Yes, absolutely, I do. And I think that also this harkens back to the terror management theory that I spoke to as well, where this urge to sort of categorize, we're driven to by virtue of making it convenient to otherize people, and therefore to avoid counting ourselves among members of a group that we fear being a member of a group. Yeah, absolutely.
And let me say too, those of you in the audience who want to submit questions, please do so through our chat function, and we will present those questions to Elizabeth. And so the other thing that struck me too was the reference from Robert Butler, in which he talked about how one of the things that he said about the changes in society, in American society in particular, that there's this sort of emphasis on youth and associating that with vitality. And it seems to be a byproduct of really the emergence of a youth culture in the US in the 1950s. David Halberstam wrote about this in his book, The 50s, that this was a social construction, basically, in which we see, continuing to play out 70 years later, that impacts how we view aging and how we engage in ageism.
Agreed, absolutely. We are undisputably a youth-focused culture, and that's not to. As a general rule, I don't think that we need to or should pit one age group against the other. And if we look to the 50s and 60s, we see many examples of that happening. And this notion of scarcity, right? That we're competing with different groups for resources, and older people are viewed erroneously in many cases as consuming more resources than perhaps they might be entitled to. And that consumption of resources by older people somehow takes away resources from younger groups, which is indeed not the case, right? It's that's apocalyptic demography and scarcity thinking that we're so wed to, that is destructive, and prevents us from coming together in advancing the human rights of any one particular age group. But really, human rights work, anti-ageism work is intergenerational, and it's not all about older people. It's about all people. And it's about our current selves, our past selves, and our future selves as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's sort of interesting how there's this sort of zero-sum view of things. To make a concession means that you give up everything. And I mean, we see that played out in relation to racial politics. We see it played out in terms of issues related to or efforts of inclusion for the LGBT community and other disadvantaged groups. And this works out in the context of the aging.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, let's see, I'm checking to see. We do not seem to have any further questions at this point. But any last closing words of wisdom from you, Elizabeth, in terms of moving forward? I mean, I think you gave a number of examples, but any words of wisdom you would like to share with the audience?
Oh, words of wisdom on the spot. I, I guess it's not particularly earth-shattering, but one very simple thing that I encourage every one of us to do is to just think about the people that we associate with on a daily basis. Think about the members of our friend groups and the people with whom we interact, and notice who makes up that group. Are they all people within 10 years, either 10 years older or 10 years younger than ourselves? And if so, why do we think that is the case? And then make an explicit effort to make friends with people who are older and younger than ourselves. It will transform our worldview. It will open us up to new understandings of ourselves and of humanity. And it's such a simple yet difficult thing to do. And it applies to age, but of course it applies to race and sex and sexual orientation and every other aspect of life. But
yeah, I think you hit on a real important point, the intentionality of engaging in an intergenerational way. And, there are some institutions that I think that in particular could be helpful in that regard, depending on, their, commitment to it and their focus. I mean, I think of, faith institutions, which could play an instrumental role in this, with the proper tools and information. And that is happening in a number of cases of different traditions.
That is absolutely true. And also, in addition to faith communities, which are tremendously important in this regard and in getting people access to relationships with people of different ages. Also, in the Ithaca College Gerontology Institute, we're an academic unit. We do research and teaching, but also we have a deep commitment to community engagement. And so if you want to follow my advice and put yourself in contact with people of different ages, hit us up. We'll be very happy to connect you with folks either through a formal program or through some other informal mechanism. So please do reach out to us as a resource.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time and your energy. And we thank those of you in the audience who participated and were part of our community this afternoon. Thank you for being here. And we hope to see you again in the future. Take care.
Thank you very much.